three forces have coalesced to produce a real energy problem. The first and the most immediate was the establishment of an effective OPEC cartel, of an effective monopoly, which, beginning in 1973, was able to raise substantially the price of oil. Incidentally, the creation and establishment of that monopoly owes a great deal to the encouragement which was given to the OPEC countries to form such an organization by the mistaken diplomacy of the United States government. The second factor has been the cumulative effect over time of government controls and regulation, beginning to go to the most important of them with the fixing of the price of natural gas from the 50s and of oil from 1971. And the third has been a change in the philosophical attitudes of the public toward the role of government in these affairs. And I want to discuss each of these three things in turn: the cartel, the cumulative effect of regulations, and the change in philosophical attitudes. So far as the cartel is concerned, there has been a great deal of misunderstanding about its behavior. We read in the paper that the cartel was formed for political reasons in order to exploit the Middle East situation. We read the paper discussions tend to be in terms of the political attitudes or the moral values or the beliefs of the country. Saudi Arabia is resisting raising prices because she's a friend of ours. And maybe Libya or Iraq is trying to raise prices because they're not friends of ours. In my opinion, that is all extremely superficial. There's a very simple interpretation of what's happening to the in oil and in the cartel. A group of nations got together and formed a monopoly. Now, again, just as with the theory of exhaustible resources, there's a well-developed theory of how a cartel should behave. Let's suppose you were able to form a cartel. What should you do? What's your practice? What's your policy? Well, in the first place, you can only form a cartel effectively insofar as somehow you can restrict supplies. Unless you can keep down the amount available, there's no way in which you can raise the price. If you fix a high price, you have to be prepared to limit the amount sold to the amount people want to buy at that price. The feasibility of having a cartel in oil arises out of the existence of two countries in particular, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, that have large flexibility in the amount of oil that they are willing and able to produce, and therefore are able to serve the function of restricting output or expanding it to the necessities of the market. In the second place, if you form a cartel, if you look at it from the point of view of Saudi Arabia as a manager of the cartel, you know very well that it's much harder for people to adjust right away than it is if you give them time. In the short run, in 1973, when the price of oil was quadrupled, people are set in their ways and their patterns. They have certain methods of operation. Overnight, the quantity demanded is not going to be much effective. Similarly, the higher price will give other people an incentive to produce substitutes. But it takes time. If you're going to produce other oil wells, you have to drill oil wells, you have to explore them, you have to develop them. Similarly with other substitutes. Therefore, the thing that is most obvious to you is that your monopoly power is very much greater at the time you form the cartel than it will be later on. And therefore, the sensible thing to do, for you to do, the way to exploit a cartel, is first to push up the price very high, and then, over time, as people start to restrict their consumption and other sources of supply come in, you gradually let the price come down so as to take advantage of your less favorable position until ultimately the price is not only back to where it was to begin with, but it's lower than it was to begin with. Because when you finally come to the end of this process, you have additional sources of supply that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't encouraged them during the cartel. That's indeed not only the logically rational way to run a cartel, it's the way almost all cartels have been run. Whether you take the Stevenson rubber restriction scheme back in the 1920s, which was very comparable, in which rubber-producing nations got together for what was then regarded as an essential item, and they quadrupled the price of rubber. And within something like 5 or 6 years, the price of natural rubber was lower than it had been to start with. Or, if you take the domestic example of the United States Steel Corporation and the Gary Agreement at the turn of the century, when U.S. Steel played the same role in the steel industry that Saudi Arabia is playing in the oil industry, of being the final adjuster or leader of the cartel, holding an umbrella over the other members of the cartel. Now, that is what's been happening. The real price of oil today is decidedly lower than it was in 1973 when the cartel was first formed, because inflation, price rises elsewhere have been greater than any rise in the dollar price of oil. Now, the cartel has not been, the price has not been coming down as fast as I thought it would, or as it would have, if it weren't for the fact that we and the rest of the world have been helping the cartel. We and the rest of the world have been helping the cartel by doing everything we can to prevent people from having an incentive to discover and produce more oil. It's not only the United States that's been guilty in this. Every country, whether it be Great Britain or other countries, have seen this as a great opportunity to make a killing, and so they have tried to impose heavy taxes or to offer exploration on terms which would bring back to the government a large fraction of the gross receipts. And the result is that you have had less exploration and less intensive search for new sources than you would have. But the United States has been the worst sinner. It's fascinating to note that energy consumption has dropped in every major country in the world except the United States since 1973. And the reason it has not dropped in the United States is because we in the United States have been trying to prevent the price of energy from reflecting fully the higher OPEC cartel price. We, in fact, have been subsidizing the import of oil. As I'm sure all of you know, the effect of the entitlement program in oil is that we are paying a subsidy of roughly $3 a barrel on every barrel of oil imported from OPEC or from anybody else outside this country. Incredible. Until the 1970s, government controls and regulations were very strongly pro-Texas, Oklahoma oil industry. Beginning in the 1920s, the oil industry induced the federal government to introduce a specially favorable treatment on taxes, the infamous percentage depletion arrangements. Beginning in the 1930s, you had pro-rationing of oil by state boards, the Texas Railroad Commission, the Oklahoma Commission, and so on. Essentially, a government state-administered cartel allocating production quotas to various outfits. And that was made possible by the federal legislation, the Connolly Hot Oil Act, which made it a federal offense to transport oil produced in excess of state quotas across state lines. Incidentally, that was not John Connolly. That was Tom Connolly, the flamboyant Texan who always used to wear a black tie. In 1959, President Eisenhower, so you can see I'm strictly bipartisan, introduced oil import quotas. That's an absolutely marvelous example of the perversity of government, of how government has an absolute genius for doing precisely the opposite of what needs to be done. Here in 1959, the situation was that foreign oil was cheap and plentiful. Domestic oil was, relatively speaking, expensive and scarce. So what do? We keep out the cheap, plentiful oil, and we encourage domestic oil by imposing a quota on the amount of oil that could be imported from abroad. The result was to make the price of oil in the United States about $1.50 a barrel higher than the price of oil in the world market. Now comes 1973, and what happens? Foreign oil becomes scarce and expensive. Domestic oil becomes, relatively speaking, cheap and available. So what do in the full wisdom of the government? We impose a tax on the production of a domestic oil and give a subsidy to importing the expensive, scarce foreign oil. If you could think of more perverse policies, you have a better imagination than I do. One thing is clear if we come back to our earlier distinction between economics and engineering. There is no economic argument for the regulation of oil. There is no argument on economic grounds for having a Department of Energy, for having a Federal Energy Administration, for having price controls. And there is almost no professional economist who will argue otherwise. There is no disagreement between Paul Samuelson and myself, both of whom write columns for Newsweek and who supposedly represent different spectrums of professional opinion, on the desirability of eliminating regulation of oil and gas. The only difference of opinion is that, having stated it would be desirable to do so, Paul goes on to say, but it's not politically feasible, so let's look at what's the least bad alternative. And I have self-restraint enough not to engage in those statements. Also, the bulk of informed professional opinion believes that the energy industry is effectively competitive, or would be if the government got its cotton-picking hands out of it. So there's no economic argument along these lines. You have had a great deal of talk about obscene profits. There again, there is no argument. There have been a number of very careful studies made of profits of the oil industry. On the average, they are not out of line. Indeed, if anything, somewhat low relative to invested capital by comparison with other industrial groups. So there is no economic argument on any level for the regulation of oil. Why then do we have it? Well, I think again, if I may quote Edward Mitchell, who said about Carter's energy program, and I quote, "The preference of houses over cars, non-energy over energy, solar energy over oil, indeed almost any other source of energy over oil, is what leaps out at you when you read the National Energy Plan. You will not find these preferences explained in any economic book. The answer is to be found in political philosophy."